Welcome to an overview training of Act 1 of 2022, which relates to assisting students experiencing education instability. Please note that the Basic Education Circular on Act 1 of 2022 can be found on the Pennsylvania Department of Education's website, which is education.pa.gov. This overview will touch on the purpose and background of Act 1, student identification and eligibility concerns, the responsibilities of the school entity and the point of contact, students showing competence or proficiency on a requirement, the alternatives to the Keystone Diploma, and PIMS considerations. The purpose of Act 1 can be broadly understood to be threefold. First, to promote on-time high school graduation. Second, to promote equal access to academics and extracurricular activities. And third, to promote the removal of systemic barriers for students who experience educational instability. Each of these topics will be discussed in turn during this presentation. Act 1 was signed into law in January of 2022, and guidance for implementation was due 180 days thereafter. This means that school entities would receive guidance in August of 2022 and would implement the protections of Act 1 beginning in the 2022-2023 school year. However, Act 1 was later amended by Act 55 of 2022. The amendment required school entities to identify students who were eligible in June of 2022, that is the 2021-2022 school year, and ensure that they receive the benefits of Act 1. That is, school entities need to identify the students who should have graduated in June of 2022, but did not graduate, and determine if they met criteria for Act 1 protections, which will be discussed next. If a school entity determines that such a non-graduate would have met Act 1 criteria, then a Keystone Diploma should be considered. Students are eligible for the protection of Act 1 if they meet two criteria. The first criteria for all students is that they changed school entities one or more times during a single school year. In order to be eligible, the change of school entities must be because of one of the following reasons: homelessness, adjudication of dependency, adjudication of delinquency, or adjudication as part of a court-ordered service under a voluntary placement or custody agreement. A student is not eligible for Act 1 protections if, as an example, they were homeless but did not change school entities one or more times during a single school year. Similarly, a student who changes school entities one or more times during a single school year, but does so not for one of the four reasons stated above, then they would not be identified under this act for protection. When considering the type and format of documentation needed to determine eligibility, school personnel should be flexible. They can accept confirmation of eligibility orally, by email, or by letter. That is, the confirmation doesn't need to be notarized or on an official letterhead to qualify. School personnel may consider confirmation from a variety of unconventional sources, such as shelter providers, outreach workers, case managers, and juvenile probation officers, just as an example. Finally, related to eligibility, school personnel should know that caregivers and the students retain the right to determine what information is shared with the school. Once eligibility information is disclosed, it should be held in confidence and not redisclosed without permission. The school entity has several responsibilities under Act 1. First, from PK through 12th grade, the school entity must make sure that equal access is provided to extracurricular activities, educational activities, and school-sponsored events. Equal access includes extending deadlines for entry or participation and the elimination of fees. When schools are considering what fees students generally must pay, school entities should consider those assessed for things like school IDs, uniforms, participation in trips or clubs, materials, padlock rentals, summer school technology, and graduation regalia. And please note, that is not an exhaustive list. It is just meant to be instructive. Schools also should recognize that Act 1 does not require the student to prove economic hardship to be eligible for the fee waiver. Once a student is identified and deemed eligible for Act 1 protections, then the waiver of fees needs to be applied. School entities are also responsible for adopting policies regarding credit assessment. While most school entities will already have such a policy, school personnel should make sure that the policy ensures that students receive both full or partial credit for work satisfactorily completed at other entities. School entities can think of partial credit as 9-week or 6-week grades that are noted on a student's report card for a course that is not yet completed. It's important to note that while not specifically defined by Act 1, partial credit is mentioned in the context of records received by the school entity, which is why ensuring that all school records are received, including those from residential placements or youth development centers, is so important. In its policy, a school entity should also account for different names for substantially similar courses that may have been taken at other schools throughout the Commonwealth. The example given here is where a course called microbiology in one school entity could fulfill the credit requirement for biology, or an elective science course in another entity. Finally, in its policy, a school entity should consider the course's substance and alignment with the standards rather than simply the name of the course. The example shown here is where a course called financial fitness in one school entity could fulfill the credit requirements for math, or perhaps a family and consumer science course in another school entity. Another school entity responsibility is to establish a point of contact, or a POC. And it is ideal but not required that each school building within the LEA have its own POC. Additionally, given the requirements of the POC, it would be best practice for the duties of the POC to be given to a school guidance counselor or social worker. Although it may make sense for a teacher or an administrator to take on the POC role as a special assignment, given a school's unique context. The first 4 responsibilities on this slide for the POC often occur during the typical student transfer process. It's the POC's responsibility to ensure that consultation with a counselor or mental health professional or access to other necessary educational services occur promptly, and that students are promptly placed in appropriate courses after receiving all school records. Act 1 requires that the POC do something that may be new for some school entities. That is, a student identified as eligible for the protection of Act 1 should work with the POC to develop and execute a graduation plan to ensure that the student's on-time graduation occurs. And a graduation plan can be as simple as a checklist of required courses and the number of electives required to graduate, and a determination of where the student stands relative to those requirements. The graduation plan must be included in the student's education records and shared with the student's educational decision maker. Based on a review of the records and the development of a graduation plan, the POC may determine that a student has successfully completed required courses. They can substitute a substantially similar course, or, as permitted by school policy, they can waive a course. When none of those options are appropriate for the student's situation, then the school entity has two additional options. First, Act 1 specifically permits the school entity to determine competency or proficiency for a given requirement by any means it deems appropriate. That can be through a final exam, an essay, a project, a discussion, or the like. If this isn't an option, then the school entity must provide an alternative or modified course that will assist a student in proving competency or proficiency by the student's on-time graduation date. There are two alternative pathways to graduation that existed before Act 1 and should be considered prior to using the Keystone Diploma. First, a chief school administrator may waive the Keystone proficiency requirements or alternative pathway to graduation requirement for extenuating circumstances. Things like a serious illness, a death in the student's immediate family, a family emergency, frequent school transfers, a transfer from out of state in grade 12. The extenuating circumstances alternative can be used for up to 5% of the graduating seniors annually without a review from the PA Department of Education. Another alternative is for a student with a disability to graduate based on IEP goals in lieu of LEA graduation requirements. But Act 1 gives two additional pathways to on-time graduation for eligible students. The first is that a student may receive a diploma from a prior LEA if the student would have met the prior school's graduation requirements. This option requires the collaboration and consent of the two chief school administrators. Then, as a last resort only, when all other options for on-time graduation have been exhausted, a school entity's point of contact may collaboratively complete the department's application for a Keystone Diploma. Once the application and all supporting materials are received, the department will determine if the student qualifies for the issuance of a Keystone Diploma. The point of contact will be notified as soon as practicable as to the department's decision. A graduation code of 806 is to be used in PIMS for all pathways to graduation described on the previous slide, except for the Keystone Diploma. If a Keystone Diploma is issued by the department, the school entity will be required to enter a code of 826 into PIMS for that student. It should be noted that there is no negative impact on a school's cohort graduation rate when using a code 806. However, the use of code 826 for the Keystone Diploma will negatively affect the school's graduation cohort rate, as the student will be captured at the local level as a non-graduate.